shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his blood boiled. Come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. And he sang as he watched and waited till his blood boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Down came a jumbuck to drink at the Billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. He sang as he shoved that jumbuck in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. He sang as he shoved that jumbuck in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Up rose water, mounted on his thoroughbred. Up rode the troopers, 1, 2, 3, with the jolly jumbuck you got in your tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, with the jolly jumbuck you got in your tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Up jumped the swagman and sprang into the Billabong. You'll never catch me alive, said he, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that Billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that Billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
That was Spencer's favorite song.
Hello everyone, my name is Wright. I'm Spencer's youngest, and on behalf of my family, I want to thank you all so much for coming here today. As you know, my father loved to party, and without all of you here, this would not be the kind of remembrance of and celebration and honoring of his life that we know all of you will help us make it. So we're here to honor and remember Spencer Victor Wright in this place that he so loved. And as my mother said, the song that we just sang may seem unusual for a service, but you may know from my dad that he wasn't terribly religious, so we wanted to reflect his preferences in music in this service. So I have many memories of my father, and an early one that I wanted to share with you is of riding over Breadloaf Mountain, coming down the mountain on Route 125. In the front seat, I was 5 years old, in the front seat between my parents with my 3 siblings in the back. And we were returning to Vermont after a winter in New Hampshire. And it was late, and it was dark, and it was raining, and the car brakes gave out. I had been hearing my mother say for a number of days that she was concerned about the car. In particular, she was concerned about the tires. She said that they were bald. which was probably true. And my father just kept saying everything was fine. He looked at the car, everything was fine. So when we were driving down the mountain and there was still a short series of switchbacks left to go, and the brakes gave out, my mother shouted. The rest of us knew better than to say anything. And my father threw the car into first gear, and he opened the car door and stuck his foot out on the road to kind of create a little drag, the way you might do with a bicycle or something a little smaller than a car. And he kind of half stood up in his seat, and I just remember his concentration as he held the wheel with his foot out like this, and we made it down 3 or 4 more switchbacks as the car slowly picked up speed, even though it was in first, because that first jolt slowed it down. And then I just remember that there's a rock wall that faces, if you come down 125, that last big turn, and we were in the other lane, but fortunately nobody was coming, and we roared across the bridge, and then got headed on the straightaway through East Middlebury. And my father just pulled his foot in and closed the car door, and said, we all sort of like were gasping, and he just laughed and said he didn't know what any of us had been worried about. So to me, that story articulates my father's deep connection to place, because he knew that mountain road really well. And also his connection to his own body and his surroundings. He had incredible confidence, as you know, not just socially, but in his movements, in his physical awareness. And you could see this even as he aged, and when he was on a walker, he would place that walker and his feet with such intentionality and sort of grace and economy of motion. And I was so struck by what an athlete he was right up until his last days. I also remember this economy and purpose when back in the 1970s, he had this book, Low-Cost Energy Efficient Shelter, sitting on our dining table for about 2 years while he drew up the plans for the Tree Farm house. And he would draw up plans and consult the book and draw up plans. And conservation was a big topic in those days, but as you may know, my father was politically conservative. And I thought it was so interesting that he understood aspects of environmental conservation in his own deeply personal way. And some of it was about money, but it wasn't just that. And I was so proud to have a father who practiced passive solar design and who hammered a nail with a few elegant swings of his hammer. And for those of you who ever saw him swing a hammer, it was a beautiful sight. And those were the same hands that in a rare moment of affection when I was a child would reach down to scratch with a single index finger, scratch the back of my neck. And I felt then, as in many other small but significant instances, a firm sense of being and belonging in the world. And it was never a closed sense of belonging that my father extended, but as you know, his metaphorical embrace was wide. I will miss my father in the coming years. I already miss him. But when I look at the woodpile along our driveway that he always asked us about, and at the Scotch pine planted behind the woodpile that he brought to my partner Karen and I as tiny seedlings when we were moving into our new home. Sorry, I got my pages mixed up. I feel that same firm sense of place and physicality and confidence and a joy in living that he modeled for so many of us for so many years.
We're up. My brother Gary put a block of wood behind the podium. I'm not sure which one of us that's intended for, Gary. For Mother, okay.
Thank you, Gary.
I'm Don Wright. I am, as I introduced before, I am the second son and third child of Spencer and Nancy, and this is my mother. Nancy means Wright. We're both going to share a little piece of writing. Hers is much older. It goes back to Make Your Own Change, but I'll let you do your own introduction. I know many of you are wondering where my father's remains are right now. They are not actually in one of the many Wright plots around Addison County. He gave his body to science, to the medical center, and they're ecstatic. This is they are seeing this as a very rare opportunity to explore and assess the long-term consequences of drinking Old Cornwall on the human body. And
We're all very worried too.
the results are not in, but those of you that had more than a few glasses, we promise to get in touch and let you know how it's looking. But he lived till he was 95, so we think it might be all good. What can go wrong with Fleischmann's yeast and Welch's grape juice and sugar and water and fermented for a solid 30 days? Or less if company was coming. How many of you here know Spence through family, through bloodlines? How many of you encountered him first at Proctor Academy? How about down here at the lake? And I assume the rest of you would raise your hand through Addison County or somewhere here in Vermont. Wonderful. I also want to mention, we don't have a specific master of ceremonies, but please stay with us afterwards. We have food. You are welcome to also use the facilities indoors. We got a portalet just because, as you know, Spence always worried about the condition of the septic tank. In fact, he would have seen you as free labor to dig up the septic tank and resolve the usual summer overflow, but he's not here. We're not going to do that. But please feel free to use the facilities indoors as well, and linger as long as you can and share your stories with us. Andover Elementary School, winter 1967. A large bus pulls up around the school's flag circle out front. The full-throated guzzling of the engine distracts the entire 1.5-story institution from its state of learning. The school principal enters the classroom of bachelor and 5th grade teacher Mr. Doggart. Red crew cut, unfortunate sartorial skirmish between tie and jacket, and signals for Donald Wright to put down his nub of a pencil and come out into the hallway. Donald drops his pencil beneath his desk in astonishment, and after stooping to recover it, bashes his head on the ascension. This part is actually made up but provided for the benefit of my siblings, who seem to think that I was in a state of perpetual head knocking from the age of 3 to 13. The consequence, which I'm sure you who attended Proctor can relate to, of all this head bashing was that I could score no better than a C- in chemistry at Proctor. Now wonderfully under the gaze of Doggart, the principal and his classmates, Donald, upon gaining the hallway with classroom doors securely shut behind him, receives the news that his father is pulled up out front with a bus full of hockey-playing Proctor boys, and would he like to go to the game or finish the day at school? After careful deliberation for under 2 seconds, Donald assures the furrow-browed principal that he can easily catch up on his lessons. Pardon me, I'm a theater guy here, so I have to insert that they lessen from day to day. That's why they're called lessons, says the Mock Turtle. Tomorrow, and given his dad couldn't possibly coach the team to a win without him, told the principal he'd better board the bus and accompany the squad to Brewster Academy in Wolfboro, New Hampshire. Unable to remember where he left his coat and hat, and fearing any obstacle preventing his escape if he doesn't hurry, Donald dashes out the door and boards the bus. Okay, Gary and Leslie and Catherine, knocking his head against the door jamb on the way out early. Immediate embarrassment ensues when he realizes that he's not only coat and hatless, but that his father isn't on the bus. And he's face to face with 20 Proctor boys whom he recognizes as great heroes, but who seem to not necessarily reciprocate the same adulation. Plus, seated in front sits a large bus driver who glares at him over a powder spray of donut sugar with the judgment of a man who's decided his father's disappearance can only be accounted for by some errant actions of the son. Well, 10 minutes later, Spence appears after using the school facilities and visiting with the school secretary. and apparently not remembering or conveniently forgetting or not really comprehending that he was holding up a busload of restless teenagers. He steps up with a hearty and glad, "Okay, we all set?" As if someone or everyone else had held up the bus. And off they go around the flagpole, down past the library, out onto Route 4, and headed east for a couple hours' ride to the campus of their foe for this Wednesday's hockey game, the aforementioned Brewster. Off they go, Spence with his sheet of plays spread out in his clipboard, his captains coming forward to Coach Wright's front seat for a few words here and there, his chocolate bar emerging mid-trip from within his pocket, his banter with the bus driver, his everyday is as bright and sunny, isn't it, as the world can be outlook, and his happy and proud son beside. And now my mother. You want the block?
No.
Just like this. I'm sorry, that's not how I should know better after all these years.
Yeah, just a little bit lower.
There you go.
Yeah, that should be it. Oh, okay, thank you. Oops. Little pivot in the roads here. I'm just going to read a little bit of Make Your Own Change, which I had originally contributed to Spence and attributed to Spence and written for him. All the ceremonies of our lives, I said to Spence shortly before we moved to the new house. This was a house that Spence had visualized and built himself. Weddings, holidays, funerals, packing up and unpacking, planting and chopping down. Sometimes I wonder how we all go on, I said. But that's it, said Spence. We just go on. We just keep on planting, or we fall through the hole. What hole, I said. In the universe, you mean? In the new house, he said, where the cellar steps are supposed to be. Jim fell through the day. No, didn't you put up a sign? I put cardboard over the opening, Spence said. I got the story from Jim. He'd been searching for a wrench on the tool shelf for the missing stairway. Where are you, Jim? Spence hollered, needing a hand with a pile of lumber. Down here, Jim guessed, in the cellar. Well, come on up here, said Spence. I can't lift this 2x4 alone, you know. And then it was Rick, a carpenter musician known as Chicken Wing because of his vigor with the bass fiddle in Jim's band. He came up next. His famous wing failed him when he backed onto the cardboard and, still clutching a can of nails, catapulted down into the rocky hole. Damn it, said Spence. You guys are busting up all my cardboard. Well, as we drew into the final days before the move to the new house that Spence built, the packing grew more frenetic. Bits of several rooms were thrown at random into the same unlabeled box. A toilet that had held out for years suddenly let go. The tractor lost its brakes as it reeled down Route 30 with the homemade beds, a broken spinning wheel, and a World War I shell full of old gunpowder that I expected to blow up any day now. A little bit. The final day arrived, and we took a last shower in the old stall we'd appropriated from Proctor Academy in New Hampshire, where we've been teaching, then loaded in mattresses, boxes full of shredded wheat and toothbrushes, the cat's dishes, my typewriter, the gallon of old Cornwall, our homemade wine, never without that, and we rattled off in the van to the tree farm. So what about water in this new house, I said to Spence. We'll have water, won't we? Water, said Spence, preoccupied with his thoughts. Well, water to bathe with, flush with, water the plants. I mean, you've told the plumber we're moving in. Oh, sure, he said, but we have to dig first, a couple of trenches, you know, the septic system, all that. I'll call Ralph this morning to come and backhoe. You haven't called the plumber yet? What time have I had, Spence said with an innocent shrug. Okay, I said, so then what happens after the trenches? Then we get to lay the pipes to connect up, Spence said. Then we'll have water going out, he said proudly, his red hair shining in the sun. And coming in, that water will be coming in, I said. Eventually, he said. We were rounding the bend of Cider Mill Road. The cat sat between us, howling. Ahead was our driveway. The new house that Spence envisioned and built stood solid stolid and dry on the crest of the green hill. Well, 2 or 3 weeks maybe, and then the water, said Spence. But don't worry, it's all set up. And so it was. There were 2 sawhorses joined by a wide plank that we use as a dining table, a 5-gallon jug, a dipper pan, the chamber pots he'd salvaged from the garage sale. We're lucky to have it so private up here, he said. You can sit on the pot as long as you like. Thank you, I said. What a treat. Look by the door, he said. Surprise. Wild roses I saw, freshly transplanted from the old broken house by Jim and Doc Collier, who lived next door. They were starting to droop, though, from the shock of transplanting. I'll admit, I related to them. They'll grow, said Spence. Just watch. It's not that, I said, blowing my nose. It's not the water either. It's all these years, I guess, and now the kid's grown up, even the youngest out of school. I know, he said. But they'll be back, I reasoned, for holidays and all, won't they? And it'll be kind of fun, just you and I, Spence, in the trees, don't you think? Yep, he said, squeezing my arm. And hey, he said, Lucian just built some shelves for your new books, he said, downstairs. Go take a look. So I peered through the doorway of my new writing room, and sure enough, there were 3 tiers of shelves lining the white walls, enough space for at least a few hundred books. Overhead, the beams from old Victor Wright's barn stretched across the room. Gray barnboard framed the windows that glanced out on the trees and beyond at the green mountains. The rounded peaks glowed in the sun like cat's eyes. Not bad, I said, blinking at the view. Not bad at all. So what did I tell you, said Spence? And he handed me a tissue and then a hammer.
Sally Caswell is going to share a few words with us. And following Sally, in your program you'll find the lyrics to Beauty of the Earth.
I wrote Spence a letter in heaven. I want to read it to you. Dear Spence, here we are celebrating your life with your wonderful family and your special friends. My late husband Hank knew you long before I did, as your family joined the Caswell family for many good times. Also, you and Hank played football for dear old Middlebury College. Then after I married Hank, our times together began. I loved your intellectual curiosity, your interest always in the other person, and all your kind deeds throughout the years. You also enjoyed a good game of bridge, which you played even at 95 years old. And it was, you had a bowl, nice big bowl of chocolate ice cream before the game. Now you are with many of your old buddies, David Thompson, Gordy Perrine, Ox Wilson, Kyle Prescott, and Hank Caswell, to mention a few. Spence, we will all miss you, but we will never forget you. A life well lived, and you are at peace now.
Words are
Williams, Proctor class of 1962, will share some words.
I feel greatly honored to be here. Spencer was Mr. Proctor to me, and I feel that in my own mind, it could have been called Spencer Wright Academy. That's the way I look at it. The last time my wife and I were here was in honor of Spencer's birthday party, his 90th birthday party. And we came from the Boston area. It was quite a long hitch. And Spencer had a little folio of $10 bills. And he gave quite a few people, he passed out $10 bills because he wanted to thank them for coming. And so a couple of years later, I was calling him on the telephone to just talk to him, see how he was doing and so forth. And I was sitting in the office of my own studio, and I said, Spencer, as I sit here, there's a $10 bill that's tacked to the wall, and it's never going to be spent, and that's $10 that you gave me for coming to your 90th birthday party. And he said, what? I gave you $10 for coming to the party? He said, I must really be losing it. So, anyway, I want to tell you a couple of quick stories. In my sophomore year, we took the PSAT exams, and we were starting to talk about college placement and so forth. And I have to say, practically the only person I really trusted on the faculty was Spencer Wright, because he would always give you a very honest answer. And so Spencer that was not his department. There was a professional college placement advisor on the faculty. But anyway, I decided to go to Spencer. And I caught him a little off guard. It wasn't an office appointment or anything like that. And so I asked him if he could help me. And he said, well, what were your PSAT scores? And I told him. And he said, Williams, you have to marry a very smart woman. As you know, Spencer was uncorrupted by convention. So the following year, I had an official appointment with the college counselor, and my parents were coming up to meet him. And I have to tell you, he was not trained to do this. He had another career, and I think they needed someone to fill the spot, and no one could do it, so at the last minute they gave it to this man who was supposed to advise us. And so we went into his office, and my parents were there. And he said, well, I think Dartmouth is a possibility, but Harvard would be a little more difficult. And I thought, this man does not know what he's talking about. And it was true. He told my parents what they wanted to hear. But when you went to Spencer, you got the truth. So, how did it come out? Well, it turns out that when I was to get married, I chose someone that Spencer would have approved of. I married a very bright woman, and it worked out just great. It worked out so well that on my honeymoon, we were coming up to Vermont, and we weren't familiar with the state, but just the mention of the word Vermont, and I immediately would think of Spencer Wright. And it was a really, I hadn't talked to him in years, but just being in the state, looking back over my life, and the very good advice that he had given to me, I thought, I have to call Spencer. I'd love to see him on my honeymoon. So, actually, we'd been on a trip to Europe, so it wasn't really the first night. But anyway, so I'd say we were, I think we were around the area of Shelburne, Vermont. And I called Spencer up, and he said, oh, I'd really like to see you. And so it was a little after dinner time, and Spencer got in the car, and he drove all the way over to see us, and we spent a little time together, and then he discreetly went back. And I realized what a wonderful and caring person he was. In addition to his athletic coaching skills and teaching skills, he was a very kind and caring person. So I want to say tell you about one other experience I had. Now, when there's a big football game, the coach gets together with the players and he says the things they need to hear before they go into the game. And we never know what it is or what it was. We hear the score, we see the game played out, but what does the coach tell the players before the big game? You know? So this was the Holderness game, and we were in our uniforms, and we were sitting at the edge of the field, and Lyle Farrell comes over. Lyle Farrell's the headmaster. And he says just the right thing. He says, Spencer, bring home the bacon. So anyway, the assistant coach, the line coach, it's his opportunity to fire us up and to, I don't know what he's going to give us, strategy or whatever he's going to give us. He sort of hoists his belt up and says, boys, I've been in some big games, very big games. And that's all he said. He and Spencer didn't really see eye to eye. So, it's Spencer's turn. What's he going to say to us? So, Spencer says, if Uncle Bob and Cousin Tilly come by, don't speak to them. Ignore them. Don't wave. Big football. Look over your plays. You can talk to them after the game. So, I guess in closing, I just want to say that I regard Spencer as a surrogate father, and whenever in my dealings with my family and my friends and my business dealings, and in many, many ways, the way I act, what I say to people, it was heavily influenced by being around Spencer. And I feel extraordinarily lucky to have been at school and had him as a teacher and a coach. And it's certainly influenced my whole life. Thank you.
repurposed bricks, ladders with a rung or two missing. Doors should be at least a century old before you put them in your house. Is Joni here? Oh. Repurposing instantly raises the value of everything, including Kleenex and grapes. Joni supported Dad in the last, 5, 6 years? Yeah, knew him well, and knew his repurposing habits. But above all, he liked old friends and old stories. Never more than when he got older, and rheumatoid arthritis made it hard for him to do stuff. We would pass through the living room and see him kind of sitting there with his head at a slant and just say, "Hey Dad, what you doing?" And he'd say, "I'm remembering." Now, one of the things he enjoyed sharing as he quizzed his grandkids about their grades was what a mediocre scholar he himself was, and how he and his brother Chuck had been sent down the hall for reading help when they moved back to Vermont during the Depression. But the truth was, he had the memory of an elephant. If you nudged him, he could give you the fine details on the Battle of Midway, but he could also tell you about the night he and Mom camped out in the lodge when you were 2 months old, bedded you down in a drawer, and then closed it by mistake. Or how he danced on an old lady's outhouse in Worcester with his cousins in the 30s, singing, "I see you, boo." And he remembered well how, as a teenager, he stole an old carriage from up at Silver Lake, only to discover, as he bounced down the mountain, that there was a hornet's nest under the seat. And so it went, recycling old adventures with new enjoyment. The time Willie Galvin flipped his car in a cornfield, Prof Sweats, bridge tips, Lyle Farrell floating the idea of Jack Camp coaching varsity football until SVW answered, "My furniture has wheels." A day wouldn't pass without the unearthing and polishing of some treasured name. Chuck, Dan, Paul, Eleanor, Gordy and Alice, Sally and Hank, Perry and Dick, Bunny, Denny, Sully, Ellie, Ox, Ralph Foote, Bill and Polly, Nancy and June, to name just a few. I remember a night in the 80s at the broken house in Cornwall. Dad was building the barn at the tree farm, and he stopped back briefly for dinner when he suddenly said to Mom, probably after a few glasses of wine, "You know, I realized something when I was hammering this afternoon. I realized that I love what I'm doing. I mean, I really love it." And that was the thing. We're a tree. He'd be the kind with a deep taproot, maybe a white oak or a hickory. He came from a stream of people who, for some reason or other, lacked the getaway gene. Revolutions and civil wars came and went, and while their siblings and cousins headed west and south to more exciting places, Azuba and Daniel, Victor and Marietta, Albertus and Elida, and finally Stanley, stayed put in Vermont. I don't know why his ancestors held on, but I do know why Spencer Wright did. He didn't remain here out of obligation. He held on to the ripe age of 95, almost 96, because he was in love with this place, with his people, with every single one of the stories they made together. And I guess that's the legacy he gives us. And Jim is going to say a couple things too.
Thanks for coming, everybody. So, about a week before he died, he announced that his favorite novel was Robin Hood. And this is information that I wish I would have had 40 years ago, because that information gave me complete and utter revelation, realizing that, my God, the rest of us are just merry men and merry women that were following him around. And when I met him 40 years ago, all I knew how to do was shoe horses, not shoot horses, shoe, like put metal on their feet. And but that soon changed, and I took a moment and made a list of some of the things that he showed me how to do. All right. So I became a broken shovel Christmas tree planter, a supervisor of Deke homecoming sandwiches and keg. At the time, the keg was left in the wrong hands. A high altitude chimney sweep, an old house crawl space pipe thawer, a confidential secret keeper because loose lips sink ships, a praiser of goods that we could use that other people may be confused enough to part with. A lot of, especially building materials. An antediluvian lawnmower procurer and repairman. An antediluvian tractor mechanic. The tractor would run, I'm quoting Alex Smith here, if it had gas, spark, and air. It had none of these things. An high altitude tree trimmer. A chainsawer of other people's trees. It says lightning never strikes twice in the same spot, but we struck twice at Phil Bewley's house. A midnight septic system installer. Steel roofer, half-lap roofer, stick your head in a bucket of tar first, half-lap roofer. Broken ladder roofer that was leaning against the compromised scaffold with rotten planks. A truck lender, because at the time, when I asked him, he goes like, why do I need a truck? I have yours. Shrimp steamer, when we were alone on the farm and I was running the show, shrimp night was a big night. I'd steam up a bunch and tell him I got them right from the ocean. And he goes, the hell you did. Hospital storyteller, burner of asphalt shingles on a neighbor's land. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason why there's a fence out there. Just a few more. Knower of nothing in the presence of authorities, especially the Middlebury College security. Dead tree thief. Midnight town gravel pile shoveler, midnight town sand pile shoveler, deep house floor sander, blank and expressionless face keeper, teller of half-truths, exaggerations, and understatements concerning the procuring of free building materials. Perpetual smiler and laughter, raiser of swords and charging into cannon fire. And so, look, Spencer Wright. Thank you. Thank you for showing him all this. Spencer Wright, whose favorite drink was anything that gurgles. Spencer Wright, whose favorite movie was Gunga Din. So I managed to press a couple of buttons. I think actually what my favorite novel is not the merry adventures of Robin Hood, but the merry adventures of Spencer Wright.
Last 20 years or so was Bunny Templeton. She's another Middlebury College grad, and she predeceased him by a year. He's having his remains spread in 6 places that I can remember. We may add a couple. One is right here at the lake, which he started in childhood and throughout his life. The other was the tree farm, which has been mentioned a few times already. Worcester, Mass, where his mother was brought up, and he spent part of his childhood and forever was in contact with his cousins down there. The Deke fraternity at Middlebury College, and Leonard Field and Proctor Academy. A couple things were mentioned about the tree farm and the house, and I should tell you that when he was given that land by my grandmother, it's about 25 acres of land. There's a ridge at the top, and you can see the Adirondacks one way and the Green Mountains the other. It was pretty much overgrown, so he employed a non-voluntary workforce to remove the brush, in particular wild cherry trees. And that non-voluntary workforce consisted of me and my siblings. We ended up, after about 2 years of clearing the land, we got the tree farm actually started by planting about 2,000 red pine. And And then we found out that red pine is not used for Christmas trees. That's a true story. And I live now in the outpost. He couldn't stop building. He's never been able to. He built the house that my mother was reading about there. Another house that he called the outpost, which is about 100 yards away where I live. And the small camp, we have 2 camps here. He built that with his father, I think right around before World War II. And when I would go down to visit him at Leslie's over the last year and a half or so, he always wanted a beaver report. And he had this beaver dam on the end of on the edge of his property. And so I would sort of add a little bit of exaggeration to the reports. I would say, that they're building a bigger dam there, they're taking more trees down, and that pond's going to be the size of Lake Dunmore at the rate they're going. And he would always go, yes. But I think secretly he admired the beavers because, like them, he couldn't stop building. He was a deacon at Middlebury College, as I mentioned, and he was a very serious member of the Dean fraternity. And to begin with, when he was at Middlebury College, he had Deke branded on his chest with a cow iron. And I asked him about the pain, and he said that his commitment to the fraternity and a lot of booze diluted it a little bit. And then I asked him, well, did everybody in the fraternity get that done? And he said, the guys who cared. And I think, is Alice Brine here? Is she here? Her husband, Gordy Brine, his name was mentioned earlier, was one of Dad's Deke brothers as well, so it's nice to have Alice here. The thing that happened too that was, I think, pretty special, we talked about his friends, and so many of his frat brothers became lifelong friends, and we saw them as kids, and we ran into them all the time as adults, and it was really a wonderful relationship. And he stayed involved with the Deke House in 2 ways. One, he had the keys to the Deke House. Most of the fraternities got sold to the school, but he held out with another group, and for alumni weekends and things like that, it would be in operation. And there was one other surreptitious activity that was going on, and I think I can publicly mention it now that he's passed. He was, as I said, the fraternities were outlawed, but he continued in some fashion to pledge undergraduates. And the thing that's one thing, but to do it in our living room. And the age of the participants of these surreptitious ceremonies were 19, 20, 21, and 19. And then Proctor Academy. My parents, as another place, my parents were there for 20 years, as many of you know. My father coached football and hockey, taught economics and modern European history. And my mother taught French and was the director of the Proctor Players. My father was my hockey coach and my mother was my French teacher. Wouldn't you say I was probably better than hockey, Mother? I didn't get beyond bonjour, but it wasn't her fault. Another thing that probably underscores a little bit, and I think some of the guys from Proctor here will substantiate this as well, is that in the 20 years that my parents were there, I think that the yearbook was dedicated to my father 3 times and my mother twice, which is probably a pretty impressive accomplishment. And his love and loyalty to Proctor was literally unbounded. And so many of you that have stayed in touch, it's been so wonderful. And, particularly Proctor's, outreach to stay in touch with him as well is was appreciated by him and all of us as well. And the day that he died, I was over there in the afternoon. I think he died that night. And I was talking to him, and he had like, some oxygen things on, and he was, in pretty rough shape. But we were still having this conversation, and I couldn't hear him like I usually could because his voice stayed pretty firm to the end. So I sort of had to put my ear right down to his mouth, and I can tell he was talking about Proctor. Just lastly here, and then I'll just wrap it up for a few seconds after that. We went on some trips with him, and particularly in his later years, but we did go on one big trip back in 2001 to England. As most of you, or many of you know, he would go to England every other year, and if he was there for 10 days, he would watch Changing of the Guards, 9 of them. So we had to sort of take one for the team because he paid for a lot of the trip. He went every day, and I went 4 or 5 times. And Spencer here, the next to the last day, his mother came in. Spencer was my roommate. He was 13. And the next to the last day, his mother comes in and says, "Get up, Spence, we got to get going." And he goes, "Where are we going?" And she said, "Changing of the Guard." And he literally flipped up almost landed back on the bed and screamed, "No." In addition to that, we also found ourselves, and again, he's paying for a lot of this trip. So you got to sort of go along with a little more than you might otherwise. And we went to pubs almost every night for dinner. He just thought it was great menu. And I thought it was okay. I mean, beer. But and then a couple of days in, my sisters Leslie and Catherine approached him and said, "Geez, Dad, is there any way that we could maybe mix it up and just choose a different restaurant for a night?" And he said, "Okay." So they chose a Thai restaurant, not his choice, but he had to go, like we had to go to the pubs. And we're at 2 tables, probably 15 feet apart. I think there was another table halfway between us. And I hear, and he's trying to get my sisters going. And I hear this, Gary. And I look over and he goes, "I can't taste my food. Can you taste yours?" We also took, I probably went on more trips than I went otherwise, and it was probably a good thing. My sister Leslie was always trying to get me to do a weekly trip with us, so we started doing that. We would drive around Addison County, and we'd get on these dirt roads and he'd say, "Take a left, take a right." I didn't know where we were half the time, but he had been in real estate. And invariably he would say, "We're getting awful close to that Champlain Bridge." And the Champlain Bridge goes from Vermont to New York. And on the other side of the Champlain Bridge is Fort Crown Point. Okay, and that's what he did his thesis on. And he would say, "Well, I think we ought to go over there and see what's going on." Well, Fort Crown Point burned down in 1770. We would go and we would drive around, and there was a point on the hill. So we would drive up this hill as far as we could go, and he couldn't, wasn't that mobile at that time. He would always tell me, "Okay, I want you to get up to the top of that hill, look down, come back and tell me what you see." And I would always come back and I say, I see burned down barracks. And then he would proceed to give me a little bit more history. And it was one of those things that I had heard it before, and it was very interesting, and I heard it 100 times. But you know what? When you're with your father, it's better to hear it than to not hear it. And they were pretty special trips that we made. He embraced life with enthusiasm, joy, and the curiosity of a kid. He was a man of action. It seemed he fit 2 lifetimes into one. There's an inscription on Jackie Robinson, for those of you who are baseball fans and more. He was the black baseball player who broke the color barrier back in the 1940s, and there's this inscription on his gravestone. And it said, "A life is not important except on the impact it has on other lives. And I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not trying to put him on a scale of Jackie Robinson, but his impact on others certainly was profound. He had lots of friends. He was always making new ones and recycling old ones. And he was especially good to older people, even during his younger years. He kept in touch with everybody. Some people collect stamps, others collect books. He collected friends. He might have built 3 churches if he died 20 years ago. And the epitaph that we thought was appropriate that we put in his obituary was he had a lot of friends. So he died 3 months ago at 95, as you all know. And it seemed there was reason not to be too sad because he had lived such a long and fruitful life. But on the other hand, he lived so long, it began to feel like he would be around forever. But nothing is forever, of course. But it sure was great knowing him, wasn't it?
If you could pull out the slip of paper that was placed in your program. And this will just take us a moment. These were some of our, us being the cousins and myself and my siblings, gathering some of Spence's favorite sayings and locations and areas of interest and whatnot. And so if you, and it gives us a chance to hear your voices. I think if we just go down along each row fairly quickly. If you didn't get one, well, you can just say pass. And why don't we just start with the back row over here. Just give us a big loud voice if you all can. And again, if you didn't get the little slip, just pass on to the next person. So we can start with John Noble here in the corner.
She was a good egg.
And then right in front of John, and we'll go across.
We've got enough to feed the Russian army. Up the river without a paddle.
Coaching football. Trot to Boston.
No funny business.
In the later years, grand tour around Addison County.
Bridge.
Spaghetti.
And we'll jump back for a moment. Laura and Mark, if you all.
Cribbage.
Yeah.
I'm going to make up my own, one of my favorites. Sometimes nonsense makes more sense than sense.
Bananas headed north.
All right, so we go next row down there.
We look like we know what we're doing.
Stacking wood.
I hate face-offs in my own zone. Never buy a new car. It loses 40% of its value when you drive it off the lot. Mike says we know what we're doing. Same thing as he had.
Squirrel traps.
Calvi's Ice Cream Parlor.
Lilac bushes.
The pickup truck.
I didn't get one, but every time we'd have a little chat, at the end of it, he'd go same after I said it.
Cheese 'em.
The honeymooners.
Bill, did you get one? No? Come down in front.
Winston Churchill.
Stealing town gravel with an unregistered trailer. If you oil the leather, it'll last a long time.
Every time he owned a piece of machinery, I'm going to be that guy.
Never bought a new machine in his life.
This is your grandfather. There's a bed upstairs. On Fort Ticonderoga, it's the big fakeroo.
A hockey strategy. No Mickey Mouse in the corners.
IGA chocolate ice cream.
any literature on World War II?
Teaching economics.
Did you hear this?
You're all too sober, said Spence, and ran about the room urging a refill.
Are you saving any money?
Clearing 15 acres on the tree farm with clippers and a handsaw.
What are you working on today?
Baskets of work gloves.
Wearing the clothing of his deceased friends.
So now we have an open section. If anybody would like to come up and share their own story, we would love to hear it.
I have another little quip.
Okay.
Archie Stone. I took over as the Lane president after Spencer's 48 years. And I walked up to him after the meeting and I said, okay, what the heck does the president do? And he looks at me with that grin on his face. He says, listen to all the complaints, then ignore them.
Well, you know all that gravel and sandy soil, the lane. Jump up or just share it right from your seat if you'd like. Is there anybody else?
I've got it. I'm not family, but I always felt like family with Spence, and I'm a bit of a poet, only last 40. I just wrote this a few hours after I heard it. Such a day, hours from the hearing, great soul befriended by humble spirit. Moons past, always the knowing twinkle, hearty hello. How about these stories, escapades, musings, stories, keeping the place sizzling? Brought by some wood for you folks in the rain. In the 30-degree mid-November was the first paint job. I on the high ladder, my friend on the low. The cold was the same. So was the warm cellar, which we used liberally. The stain hell. Oh, just throw it on, boys, it will be fine. Thank you, my friend. All the kindness, the parties that we held. For your friend, my mother, a smile that will never fade. That's nice that you gave to us all. Same, you would always say. When our conversation had come to an amicable parting, same to my quite wonderful, loving spirit, same.
I'm a Proctor boy, a Proctor graduate, which makes me a rare Proctor boy. I'm kidding. My name is Proctor Bennett. Spencer didn't know that. He knew me as Bennett. And I didn't have him as a coach, so my experience with him was kind of unique. I saw him only as a scholarly sort of inspiration. When I went to Proctor, I was a sophomore, and I was taking Latin, and I was going to take French, and the school was small enough so you couldn't take both Latin and French and still fit in all of the curriculum you had to do as a sophomore. So I missed modern European civilization, and I wasn't able to take it until my senior year. And by that time, I knew Spencer pretty well, and of course, I'd been in theater with his wife Nancy, and so I knew the family pretty well, but I didn't really know Spencer as a teacher. So I came into the modern European civilization class as a senior. And after the first day of class, Spencer pulled me aside and he says, "Bennett," he says, "you're a senior." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You don't think you're going to get away with taking my class as a senior without doing something extra?" And of course, that's exactly what I thought. You know. It's going to be easy because the grading scale would be for sophomores. And of course, I was wiser and more learned than they. And so anyway, he said, "No, you're not going to do this." So he handed me this book, and he said, "Read this book, and you better read it well because you're going to teach it one day a week in the class for a 15-minute segment or something." And it was Mon Common Wolf by Francis Parkman. And I never even heard of Francis Parkman. And I started to read it, and it was pretty thick stuff. But what I learned is you couldn't get in front of a class and teach just because you read it once. You had to read it like 9 times and then put it on index cards and summarize what it was about, and you had to be able to draw the maps. And that's what I did for that portion of my senior year, and it brought in me such a love for history that I am an avid history buff. I suppose there's some in my blood, since my father was as well. But it was Spencer who introduced me to Francis Parkman. I have his complete works now. And he really engendered in me a great love for learning and an understanding that a teacher has to really understand what he's teaching and not just what's on the page itself. So that's my recollection of Spencer as a scholar and as an inspiration to me, and he really changed my life, and I'll never forget it.
We'll get the Proctor boys done early. But reading recently, the author used the phrase, sadness is a message of love. But being here today, happy and excited to talk about Spencer is a message of love. And we need to think about that this way. I want to say to Spencer and Nancy's children that I don't know you or remember you very well, but your family was inspirational and part of a really good team at Proctor in the 60s, and there are 10 of us here at least, and that's part of your parents and you as members of that team. You should be incredibly proud of that. Proctor changed our lives, I think we would all say, that are here. It certainly changed mine. It gave me a sense of success, a sense of overcoming challenge. It sent me to Outward Bound in the spring of 1969, my graduating year. And there I went through offshore Maine, and I was as cold as a person can be and survive. At 40 knot winds for 12 hours on 40-degree water. And that's only important for this story because when I got to College Park, Maryland, I started crewing in a sailboat in Chesapeake Bay. So one April, there was a sailboat race. It was going to go overnight. I packed all this stuff to stay warm. And I got in the car, the guy that was giving me a ride to the boat, I threw this stuff in the back. We're going overnight one night. And I said, I'm sorry, but I've been so cold on the water, I just don't want to revisit it. And he said, yeah, I know what you mean. Sailing, you get cold. Coldest I've ever been was when I was in high school and I played ice hockey. It would get so cold, we would take two jock straps and put one over one ear and one over the other ear. And I looked at him and I said, you went to Proctor Academy. And he had. The honest God's truth. Spencer was older than other members of the team. Spencer and Nancy were the generation ahead of the other members of the team that taught us. And, you know, they were Mr. Wright. Behind their back, they were Spencer or Spence, Nancy. He had another name behind his back, which was Carrot Top. I'm really quite sure he knew that. I don't know he ever inflicted it. For those of you who did not know him as a teacher, he would sort of prowl the classroom, and you would just watch him or you wouldn't watch him. If you kicked your shoes off, the shoe might get picked up, swooped up, and thrown out the window. And it didn't matter, it was the third floor building and there was a snowbank outside. Or he would throw a piece of chalk at you, or an eraser. But he also listened. He gave these form tests. They were multiple choice 50 questions. Frequently, the questions just didn't make sense. And you would get it wrong because there would be a right answer in the form. But you could challenge that question. He gave everybody a chance to say,
night. My mother left the house. My dad's company provided us with an overnight babysitter, and the Wright family organization swung into action. 2 first cousins showed up at our door the next afternoon, packed us up as kids, and brought us to the broken house to test Uncle Spencer's coaching and team management skills. He now had 3 additional children that he inherited for 2 more months that summer. So to share with you some of the experiences we had, which completely broadened my horizon as a child who was living in southern New York State, son of an IBMer, and coming to the broken house. And it was still broken. I'm not sure, and Nancy can check with how much running water we had. I know that Gary and I used, our bathroom facility was located outside the hut. But some of the things that entered my life that summer were cucumber sandwiches, pea soup, homemade wine, which was constantly being done in the kitchen, candy sticks, which were being sold at the store. They were a reward for non-volunteer labor, picking up antique bottles to sell in a Cornwall craft store. I lived with Gary in the hut. There were nights playing endless games of war and these little hockey games where you move the men around and shoot the puck. It was probably lights out, I don't know, 9:30 or 10 o'clock. I doubt if Gary never got to sleep much before 1 in the morning. And occasionally you'd see the flashlight coming down the hill. I remember one night clearly Spence and Dan had been drinking because the flashlight wandered left and right. Gary and I would quickly pack up the cards in the hockey game and jump back in our sleeping bags. I also remember his pipe and Prince Albert tobacco. And this camp had for many, many years the leftover empty cans that were here in the garage that held nails and screws and what have you. Games of pom-pom pull-away between the Cornwall craft store and the Collier property. Was an open field there. And one of the rewards at night, he would come out with a cane and he would lead off the game of pom-pom pull-away, sort of like Red Rover, come over, and he would sit in the middle of the field and play with us. I mentioned the broken house. We talk about involuntary labor. There was marble day, there was gravel day, there was takedown barn day, there was antique bottle hunting and the antique garbage pits somewhere between Collier's and the apple trees. There were apple fights. There was the Collier girls. Probably the single constant non-voluntary labor was denailing boards. So Uncle Spencer would take down barns, and many of them had cedar shake roofs, pull the shakes off, and then needed a crew to pull all the nails out well. That was 7 of us. Plus we would raise a small army in the neighborhood. We knew where every claw hammer was, and there was he would alternate the goal at night. It was either take the nails out of these 4 boards and he would handpick them, or fill the galvanized pail up to this level and then you're done. And the reward would be to play pom-pom pull away. But that was a summer. It was like nothing ever missed a beat. We showed up. It was just life as normal. These were some of the activities and things we were just in. But for 7 weeks that summer, we lived with Gary, Leslie, Donald, and Catherine. And I actually remember Aunt Nancy constantly writing, trying to get her writing career started. She would disappear up into one of the upper rooms of the house, never to be disturbed before 11 or 12 o'clock during the day. She followed her love of writing.
But I always said if you started bleeding,
So the other involuntary labor story is, so Leslie and Sandy are 10 years old, I believe. Probably 10 years, 10, 11 years, 10 years old. And you would entrust the 2 girls to run Cornwall Crafts with probably, I don't know how many, $100,000 worth of furniture inventory and what have you. But it was a wonderful summer and experience I'll never forget, and great stories. And there are more behind this, but I think I've given you some of the details.
Spence would just get in the car and drive around the other side of the building where Nancy couldn't see the car, and leave Catherine in it running. And then go off and have coffee at Farrell's house, watch his watch, and then come back just in time to come back around like he'd come from home and do the handoff. And the other thing about Bill's story...
I didn't know that.
It's good for Spence.
So we watched it every day. It was kind of fun. We were always having a pool about whether you would catch him or not. So Bill's story about arguing about your grade. A lot of the questions, first of all, that 50-question test was designed to be 2 points a question. It was 5. And then the other thing was you're going to write the exam yourself. I'm not going to write it because that would be unfair. I know the stuff you don't. You write the test. So what each person had to come in with 10 questions, or 10 answers to a question, or 10 questions, that's what it was. So then he would take all these questions and then he would pick maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 of them and just put 1, 3, 6, 8 on the blackboard and walk out. And you were supposed to write all the correct answers to that question and then leave the paper under the number. Well, of course, at the end of the test, you would hand them out to different people, you'd grade them, and you would come out with maybe I would have a D- instead of a D+, and I was a little upset because I wasn't getting treated the way I should be. So I would go in and argue with him, and he always came in off the athletic field smelly and sweaty, and he'd have these wool pants on, plaid socks, or maybe gray socks, and smoking a disgusting pipe. And I mean, it was quite a show to start with, and he was intimidating. I remember, if you'll pardon my French, so one of my friends said, "Spence, right, he always scared the shit out of me." So he would sit there and say, "What's the problem?" I said, "Well, this answer I have for this question is right." "It is? Well, why do you think so?" And you'd argue and argue, and he'd ask another question, and you'd argue and argue, and you knew you were out in left field. You thought maybe you were getting through to him. He was getting tired of you. He was going to give you the point. Because if I got that half a point, got that D+, it would have not better than my record. So he would say, "I'll tell you what." He said, "You've done some thought. You've given it some thought. You've done some research, and you've got a couple of points there. I don't agree with you at all, but you've done the work." He said, "So I'm going to flip a coin." And he said, "You're going to call it. I don't want to call it. You call it. I want it to be fair." And he says, "If you win, I'll give you the half a point you need to get your D+." And then he said, "Of course, if it's going to be fair, if you lose the toss, I'm going to take a half a point away from you. It'll be a D- instead of just a D." Well, then he starts to sweat. "You want to do it? You want to flip a coin?" And you get the coin out. I'm only like 25 years old. What do I do? So finally I say, "Okay, I'll flip the coin." And then he flipped the coin, and I said, "Heads." And of course it was always tails. That's the whole story.
Mark Wright.
Behind. A bark pierces through the air from a place he can't see but knows the precise origin of. It forces him to a halt. "Hey, why don't you come over here and tell me a story?" Disappointed that whatever activity the boy had decided on was to be postponed, he drops his stick, slumps over to the steps of the cabin, and opens the creaky door. The boy is greeted by a stern, loving face sporting a straw hat. "Grab us 2 bowls of ice cream and sit down with me." The boy does as he's told, reaching high up for the ice cream and feeling for the cool box, spooning a few scoops into 2 paper bowls. They sit together and chuckle and tell stories.
Hello. So When I think of Grandpa, I of course think of the tree farm. I think of the even, repetitive sound of him splitting wood at literally any hour of the day, the not-so-quiet hum of his brakeless tractor, the organic nature in which he planted and pruned trees. I think of bumpy driveways and broken doorknobs and mismatched furniture, of a funny wooden box full of odd cans of soup I would never eat, a cereal shelf so low that I knew of its existence before I could walk, and of course, a freezer full of ice cream. I think of sitting in the living room of a hand-built Vermont home and being transported to England to watch the changing of the guards at any hour of the day, of a seemingly natural balance between naps and productivity, work and play, of plastic bags stuffed with leaves and wood chip piles next to those same plastic bags drying on the line come spring. Minus the trash burning, if he wasn't the OG environmentalist, I don't know who is. I think of a permanently set up folding card table not too far away from a bottomless box of wine and phone table with enough scraps of notepaper to supply the town of Cornwall. I think of all of these things and so many more, and how, in all of their imperfections, they are perfect.
Hello. I'm Zaylee. I'm the middleest grandchild. As many of you know, I'm carrying the first of the next Wright generation. The next set of babies was eagerly anticipated by Grandpa. When he realized that we were taking our sweet time getting married, none of us are married yet, he skipped right over it and started asking when the kids were coming. Grandpa made it clear how much he adored his big, sprawling family, often telling me that he wished he had even more children, which I'm sure Grandma would have loved, and grandchildren. Each new member was greeted with what he would call the big hello. I couldn't wait to tell him that the baby he'd been waiting for was finally on the way. However, Grandpa passed away the day we heard our son's heartbeat for the first time. I wish my kid was going to know what it was like to not only get the big hello when entering the world, but to get it every time he walked into Grandpa's house. That shout of, "What's going on?" that made us know that we were wanted and our drop-ins were never inconvenient. Though they did not get a chance to meet, sometimes the baby kicks when I'm enjoying a bowl of ice cream, playing bridge, or telling his father a list of improvements I would like made to the house and lawn. It gives me hope that there is plenty of Grandpa in the next generation.
I'm Alex, and I'm a big softie, but we're gonna get through it. And you probably figured out the reverse birth order we're going in, so you know my place. When I think of my grandpa, when I think about the end of my life, I think of sitting in that little camp right behind us, surrounded by kids and grandkids, and kind of like Zaylee just said, as many as possible. Which my girlfriend's not always pleased to hear when I say I want 10, but it's fine. And really what I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of them like playing cards and arguing and just chatting and, maybe even ignoring me entirely. But really what I'm thinking about is my grandfather, when we would do the same thing for the last, 20 or so years. And, he taught me a lot of lessons. I didn't learn all of them. I still don't really stand up as straight as I should. I just hurt my back, so it's not any better today. I'm not slouching for effect. But probably the most important lesson he kind of taught me was basically how I want to live my life. And I mean no discredit to my two grandmothers here today, but who I want to be. And that's about it.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I'm known as the oldest grandchild, but it's not quite true. When I think about Grandpa, I think about all I learned from him, just being around him. He taught me how to live a full life, how to value what you have, and the importance of a good story. He said this better than he ever could. He actually sent all his grandchildren a letter shortly before he passed, and I want to share two small things from that. He wrote, "The lake is there, and you are fortunate to have it, so don't forget to use it. That property requires work. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Also, don't forget to relax and play a little bridge." And finally, he said, remember my recipe for living a long life. Don't worry.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm the real oldest. By 9 months. Remember that? Going last is tough, and I think we have one song after this, and then food and porta potties. But I'm going to get through this too, but I just wanted to say thank you for making it feel like he's here a little bit today. I want to talk to you, Grandpa said. I was about 14, sitting in a hard wooden chair across the table from him at the tree farm. A stack of neatly open letters sat sorted into two piles on the table between us. I heard your parents are separated. I'm only going to say this once, but I want you to hear it. Your dad is still part of this family. Your other grandparents are still part of this family. I don't know what the plan is for you and your sister, but I want you to know you can always stay here as long as you want. You understand? Grandpa is focused on place. I've heard 1,000 times that there's a place to stay at the tree farm, that we're lucky to have the lake, that I can stop by anytime. By repeating these phrases so frequently, Grandpa himself became a place for me, a place that always loved, always listened, always told a story with a somewhat loosely defined lesson, a place that always felt like home. Because with these phrases and stories, he passed the feeling of belonging on to all of us, his family, this large group of somewhat related or acquainted people who loved him.